Good evening, everybody. Let's just reflect. There's a lot of snow out there right now. Everybody who's here tonight is here because they recognize that this is both an important and a challenging and interesting discussion for us to have as a state and one we have to wrestle with. I shared a little bit earlier gratitude for the partners who helped us bring this event together to bring our keynote here. I'm Dan Smith. For those who missed it, I'm President and CEO of the Vermont Community Foundation. And I'm just really grateful that people took the time to come on a snowy, challenging day to be a part of this discussion. Across the room and on the chairs, you'll find little note cards. Those are quotes from Vermont men and boys, parents, family members, educators in some cases, just to give some additional Vermont context to the data and the conversation that we're going to have tonight. It's important to keep the voices of those who are experiencing these systems and these conditions at the heart of what we're trying to solve for and what we're trying to think about. This is important to us at the Community Foundation because of our work to close the opportunity gap in Vermont. And we deeply believe that community is only as strong as our neighbor's experience. So when our neighbor is wrestling with a challenging system or being cast aside by an institution, that doesn't just affect their experience, it affects the strength of the community of which we're a part. So it affects our community. Closing the opportunity gap, we think about with three key ideas. First, the absence of opportunity and hope is a breeding ground for disengagement and discord. And second, that disengagement has shared civic, economic, and social consequences that we're wrestling with. Now, I'm going to give a little context to that. I'm going to put somebody on the spot. Chelsea Bardot-Lewis is here. She runs an employment services agency called Working Fields that puts people coming out of incarceration and coming out of treatment for substance use disorder to work in Vermont companies. At the University of Vermont, at the Community College of Vermont, part of the reason we came together in the Curtis Fund with their scholarship grant making, we see a rough ratio of 65% to 35%, 70-30, in terms of the ratio of women enrolling to young men enrolling. Chelsea's company sees the opposite ratio, coming out of incarceration, coming out of treatment for substance use disorder, right here in Vermont, the opposite ratio, 70% men, 30% women. And so we see where the ratio mirrors itself in terms of the consequences for our communities. And that's why we're here to have what is a challenging conversation, a difficult one, but I'm confident that we as a community can really hold multiple things in our hearts and in our minds and know that multiple things can be true and that we can also make progress in it in Vermont because when we work together, we're able to get things done. I am delighted to introduce our host tonight, President Suresh Garamella. I'm going to hand over the microphone to him in just a second. But I do have to say, President Garamella has been a force of nature at this university and in Vermont. I'm just grateful for his leadership. He's the 27th president of the University of Vermont. He's a professor of mechanical engineering, and his leadership here at UVM has emphasized access and affordability and support for student success, investment in the incredibly distinctive research functions that exist here at the university, and a commitment to the land grant mission of the university across Vermont communities. So it's an incredible impact in the state of Vermont. It's an economic engine, and it's an engine of change and strength for Vermont communities. So thank you very much, Suresh, for helping us out tonight and being here to host.
Speaking of forces of nature, there are quite a few here. One will join the stage after me and one went before me. So welcome, everyone. Thank you for being here. It was a little challenging this morning, but the roads are clear today, and I'm glad you're all here to listen to a very important, to participate, I guess, in a very important conversation, which I think it's time we had. And to some extent, we've been having, I think. It's a complicated conversation, and Richard in some remarks earlier was saying, we need to be able to hold two thoughts in mind, and it's interesting because we use that as a tagline for a class I teach with David Jenneman. I don't know, he's the dean of our honors college, And it's on civil discourse. We get a small group of students together and talk about difficult topics in a small room with Chatham House rule, that people are able to contribute and talk to each other and learn. And it is amazing how when the door is closed and students are given free rein, there is not the groupthink that they're generally exhibiting outside. So I like the F. Scott Fitzgerald thought that you get to hold two potentially opposing views at the same time. So thank you all for coming this evening. I'm really not going to take responsibility or the credit for being the host. I was invited to be here. I was asked to not talk for too long. So I will try to keep this short. But I am very proud that the University of Vermont is hosting this, the location that we're here. I'd like to thank all the people that came together to make Richard Reeves' visit possible. So clearly you've heard from Dan Smith that the Vermont Community Foundation was a big part of it, the McClure Foundation, the Curtis Fund, and certainly Rich and Deb Tarrant, who couldn't be here today, but have been great supporters, great friends, and their foundation as well. I've had ongoing conversations with Rich and Deb about this issue we're talking about today, and I'm really glad that we've now moved to this conversation in a public forum. Certainly Scott Giles and VSAC, one of my favorite people in Vermont, one of the most successful and important people in Vermont, I think, in the organization. They play a critical role in making possible higher education and making it accessible to Vermonters. And of course, Joyce Judy and the essential work that CCV, the Community College of Vermont, does. It's so important to our education, to our workforce development pathways and such. Both are great partners tonight and always, and I'm thankful for their partnership. Of course, our own UVM Foundation has been a great partner, and our work at UVM in expanding access and affordability obviously requires a strong commitment from the state of Vermont, which has been generous to us, and from the generosity of our alumni and friends. And so certainly the foundation is an important part of our of the way we conduct our work, and many of our friends and alumni who contribute to our success are here. So thank you for that. I must also recognize the many people who work together to make tonight work so well, especially Lauren, as some have pointed out, at the Tarrant Foundation. She really worries a lot, but things come out okay at the end. So, and certainly several key members of the UVM Foundation, the CCV, and here at UVM as well. So thanks to all. So it's exciting to have Richard Reeves join us to bring a sharp focus to an issue which I think is crucial to the future of Vermont in particular, and certainly to the rest of the nation. And I think it aligns with the missions of our institutions as well. I have often said, and it's interesting the word opportunity came up in Dan's remarks, that the greatest attribute of higher education is that it has the capacity to create opportunity. And so this word opportunity, I take almost as a sacred word. It's an opportunity for our society and for our communities by sparking and supporting innovation, by advancing skills for our workforce, and by providing the foundation and the resources for the kinds of inquiry that lead to greater understanding, and offer a greater array of social, economic, technological progress. So I think this focus on opportunity that Dan mentioned is critical. Undoubtedly, higher education creates opportunity for individuals. UVM, CCV, and all the other colleges and universities in this state and elsewhere, we provide a measurably beneficial service to students by preparing them for positions and careers later. But and it's been shown that they have a higher pay and greater opportunities and all that. But it goes well beyond career preparation, right? As we all know, it truly helps develop thoughtful citizens of the world. These folks become leaders of the future, and I think a well-rounded education rooted in a liberal arts core is critical. And so UVM is taking steps to ensure that the young men of Vermont and across the country continue to see the opportunity in higher education that young women do and are ready and able to take advantage of it. So conversations like today's are an important part of that. And they will lead to more concrete measures that invite young men into our institutions, support and motivate them here, and launch them to success in their future careers. Our admissions and enrollment management teams, led by our wonderful Jay Jacobs, who's here, they're doing an excellent job in fostering greater gender balance among our students against the headwinds we're discussing today. Our focus on affordability, a focus on opportunity, and a focus on community is paying dividends. At least that's what I see. So our tuition freeze, if anybody knows anything about me, we've frozen tuition for 5 years here and extended that for a 6th year for Vermonters. And I think what it does is to make the value proposition of attending UVM clearer. I hope you've heard about the UVM Promise, where we, on our own, now have a program where any Vermont family making less than $75,000 can send their children to UVM paying no tuition at all. So if you've not heard about that, please look it up and spread the word. We would like more Vermonters to take advantage of that. It covers more than half of Vermont households, so we're very proud of that. And then we have great pathways and partnerships with CCV, where folks can go there and come to us, and we partner well together. And what we're trying to do is to increase the participation of high school graduates in Vermont in higher education. That's our joint goal. And the number of high school graduates in Vermont is shrinking alarmingly. I'll throw out the statistic that animates me and worries me the most. We had 7,200 high school graduates in Vermont in 2010 and about 5,100 in 2020. If that number doesn't worry you, it should. So, whereas the number of Vermonters attending UVM has stayed steady, so we're very proud of our service to Vermonters, but I think that's a number that we need to worry about. So greater affordability, of course, leads to greater and more widespread access. But we're also building this culture of innovation and entrepreneurship with hands-on learning and research opportunities, study abroad opportunities, et cetera, that is truly inclusive of the interests and needs of all students, including men. And I think it's important for us to make sure that we're including them in the opportunities. We need to focus on the individual growth and success of each student. And when men and women feel like they belong, they stick to it and they graduate. And so we're very proud that our graduation and retention rates are very high. We're in the top 4 to 5% of graduation rates among public universities in the country. So it's not just bringing in students, but getting them out in a timely manner and having them, take on jobs that make them productive is very critical to us. So we remain committed to that. We've partnered with our friend Rick Dalton. Can't see him in the audience, but I know he's here. He's there. Amazing man. If you've not talked to him, please do. He and Jay are piloting this Young Men of Talent program, where 100 Latino and Black men are being sort of chaperoned through and supported through high school, UVM, and until they get jobs. And I think it's a great opportunity and a great experiment that I will do all I can to help them succeed. And the last thing I'll say is the key part of the Young Men of Talent program is not just financial support and things like that, but mentorship. And I think that providing mentorship, providing role models, there's nothing more important than that in the success of our students. As a professor and as in my role as a president, the thing I've enjoyed most is to hang out with our students and try to mentor them and serve as a role model to the extent I can. It's FaceTime with them. I don't mean FaceTime, it's FaceTime with them. and the work that connects students together, I think that is what has the greatest impact. So I'm sure Richard has more to say in this regard, and I think that's what we should focus on in higher education as we try to scale and expand access. And speaking of role models, we have no better example of a leader and a mentor than my colleague Joyce Judy, whom Dan will introduce next. So thank you all for coming, and I'm looking forward to a great evening here. Thank you.
So next I'm Oh gosh, thrilled to invite up a former colleague of mine when I worked in the Vermont State College system, Joyce Judy, who's president of the Community College of Vermont. She's the longest serving president of the Community College of Vermont, and as I mentioned earlier, probably has her signature on more diplomas than any person ever in the state. But she's a one-person engine for economic mobility who's built an incredible team at the community college. There are 25 academic centers, and there are 12 academic centers within 25 miles of every Vermonter. I'm making sure Katie Mobley, she's nodding if I got that right. But most importantly, I think just in terms of understanding the student body, Joyce grew up on a farm. She still goes back to her family dairy farm and does chores on the weekends and takes care of the animals and makes sure the sap is flowing and turning into maple syrup. So she understands where a lot of those students that she's working with are coming from. So I'm thrilled to introduce my friend, Joyce Judy.
Dan asked me what he could say about me, and I said, just be nice because I'm introducing you to your board next week. So payback, I grew up in a big family, payback is deadly. So thank you, Dan. So it is an honor for us to be here to host Richard Reeves in Vermont. And we are so proud to collaborate with so many of our partners, and you've heard them tonight, but I would just be remiss if I didn't offer a special thanks to the Vermont Community Foundation. Dan and his team have been amazing. The Tarrant Foundation, the J. Warren and Lois McClure Foundation, the Curtis Fund, UVM. President Caramel is just an incredibly strong partner, and I think he alluded to the number of pathways that we have been able to create together between CCV and the University of Vermont, as well as the other public and private institutions in Vermont. Because so many students come to us and they aspire to something much greater, but we can help them get started and then transition on. And also to VSAC. Scott Giles, wherever you are, Scott has been an incredible supporter of CCV and helping to create so many more opportunities for Vermonters and making it so that it truly is affordable for them to continue their education. So Scott, wherever you are, thank you. So it is true that in Vermont, males pursue higher education at a much lower rate than females. Of the 10,000 Vermonters who attend CCV each year, only about 30% of them identify as male. Vermont has the lowest college continuation rate among boys of all New England states, and the percentage of young men in Vermont's workforce was low and fell significantly during COVID. While tonight's conversation focuses on the disengagement of young men, and I think you've heard this from a number of speakers already, we also need to acknowledge that women still face disadvantages. At the same time we work to re-engage young men, we need to continue to support young women. This is not a zero-sum game. As Richard Reeves has said, doing more for boys and girls, boys and men, doesn't mean doing less for women and girls. While at CCV, we wish the number of young men walking through our doors, both physically and virtually, was higher. But thousands of young men do enroll every year. Some are high school seniors getting a head start in college. Some are dads, sometimes single, sometimes with a partner, who want to create a better future for themselves and their families. Some are military veterans transitioning to civilian life. Others have been hurt on the job and need to gain new skills, and the list goes on. As you can see, they come for lots of different reasons. But we have also seen that many of CCV students who identify as males have similar goals, including they want to make more money, they want a career, not a job, they want to work in jobs that give them respect, and they want to be able to support their families. We also hear from them many common challenges. Some struggle with mental health, some with past substance use disorder. Many find it difficult to ask for help. Many face pressure to prioritize work over school. and several carry burdens at home that threaten their ability to succeed in college. And yet we all need to recognize that these challenges often aren't visible on the surface. I think of a young man I recently talked with in Newport. He was the oldest of 3 siblings, and he was from a broken household. My words, not his. And he felt largely responsible for taking care of his brothers. And as a teenager, he told me he was hustling and working 2 or 3 jobs and worrying every day about whether he was going to make enough money to feed his brothers. But he also told me that in high school, and this isn't a criticism of high school, this is just what he said. He told me when I was in high school, I was labeled as lazy and disengaged, and I was given the message that I would never be successful. I share this because so often we don't have the full picture of someone's life. It's so easy to label our children and students or to overlook their potential, but it's a lot harder to pay attention, to listen, and encourage. So how does CCV support male-identifying students? Here are some things we do, and many of them we aspire to do. We are there for them whenever they are ready to continue their education, whether it's at 16, 25, or 60. We also work to encourage their potential. This means listening to them through conversation, paying attention to their interests, and connecting them to an advisor. It means taking time to ask questions. What do you like to do? What are you curious about? And what are you good at? We also strive to focus on students as a whole person. This means seeking to understand their life circumstances. What are they juggling? And what will compete for their time as they enroll in courses? We also try to cultivate a diverse faculty and staff. We know, and this is something that President Garamella referred to, we know that young men benefit from positive role modeling and may be more likely to succeed when they have male teachers, especially in subjects where young men are falling behind. I think you will see that in some of the writings of Richard when he talks about English. Our goal is also to be responsive to a diverse student body. Many of our students are non-traditional. And if we can provide relevant programs that allow students to continue their education toward a practical goal, we feel we are better serving their needs. For example, we are partnering with employers to offer learn and earn pathways that make it easier for them to continue working and earning money while also going to school. I was intrigued by the concept coined by Vermont author and educator Ken Cato. By placing value on, and I quote, know-how as much as know. So many of our male students have practical, hands-on skills that aren't always valued in the classroom. I had a nephew that this was so true. By paying attention to those skills and interests, we can help students connect the classroom learning to real life, and at the same time, help build their confidence and a sense of purpose. I want to share a personal anecdote. My family farms, as Dan said, in a neighboring state, and we employ often a few high school students, especially young men. And I spend some time there. I never describe what I do. Sometimes they ask me, but rarely. But I generally ask them, when I'm working with them, what they think about school. And it's always disheartening to me because so many of them, they say things like, school's a waste of time, or they don't know why they need to be there. They rarely see themselves as going to college. And yet, they are good employees with a good work ethic. They show up every day, they work hard, and they're interested in what they're doing. If they continued their education after high school, or if they wanted to continue their education after high school, it could pay such dividends for them and their families. And these young men aren't very different from many of the students who find their way to CCV. We all have a role to play, whether by helping young men see the value in continuing their education, or by shaping education to be more relevant and compelling, or by simply providing encouragement. For many of our students who may not have seen themselves going to college, there has been one person who has made a difference, a coach, a teacher, a neighbor who noticed and encouraged them. And here's a couple of examples that students have shared with me when they realized that they could go to college, and that we also need to never underestimate the power of our words and support. So an 11th grader who was pretty shy told me he didn't see himself as going to college. But a guidance counselor noticed his passion for numbers and said, "You seem to be on a roll with your classes. Have you considered early college at CCV?" Another high school student told me that he and his family decided when he was in junior high that college was not in the cards for him because they simply couldn't afford it. And a teacher told him, "You should take a dual enrollment class at CCV. It's free to you, you'll earn college credit, and you can go to UVM." And she said, "And I know you can do it." Once enrolled, he gained confidence, learned about financial aid and all the other options that were available to him, and he's on his way. We all have the power to be someone who makes a difference in the young male student in Vermont, and CCV is incredibly proud to support Vermont's boys and men by helping them nurture their interests, gain the skills they need to succeed in meaningful careers, and create brighter futures for themselves and their families. Thank you.
All right. I'm going to turn it over in just a moment to our keynote speaker, Richard Reeves. Richard spoke at the 2018 Vermont Community Foundation annual meeting, which was held at the Addison County Fair and Field Day grounds. So he's now had the unique experience of coming to Vermont to speak at a county fairground and in a blizzard. So hopefully the quality of the IPAs is making up for it. Richard is the president of the American Institute for Boys and Men, an organization with a mission to raise awareness about the problems facing boys and men and advocate for institutional solutions. His 2022 book of Boys and Men is why we're here tonight, but it was described as a landmark by the New York Times, and it was named Book of the Year by the Economist and the New Yorker. He's a non-resident senior fellow at the Brookings Institution in Washington, D.C., where he previously directed the Future of the Middle Class Initiative and the Center on Children and Families. He's served in government in the UK. He's written for The Guardian and The Observer. Political magazine once named him one of the top 50 thinkers in the US. That was 2017. I don't know where he is right now. Actually, I do know where he is. He's right here in Vermont talking to us. So please join me in welcoming Richard Reeves.
Thank you for mentioning that Top 50 award, Dan. I appreciate it. You know, I'd always seen that award as just kind of clickbait nonsense. You know, they always make up these lists, 40 people under 40, 30 under 30, and I always just dismiss them as completely irrelevant. But that year, I just felt there was something a bit different about their quality of the judging. You know, just like 2017, unusually good discernment. And you're right, I was here six years ago. We ate outside. We had a barbecue, so I'm totally confused now. I brought shorts. I don't understand it. I am getting both experiences. And Dan's mentioned that I served in the UK government, so that might have given away a little bit. But just in case, it's important to clear up any awkwardness that you might be feeling right now, listening to the president of the American Institute for Boys and Men. I do, in fact, live in East Tennessee. I do live in East Tennessee, that's where I'm from, but the accent you're hearing is a British accent, but I became a proud American citizen in 2016. In fact, I became a US citizen on the very last day in Maryland, where I was living at the time, the very last day that you could register to vote, in the very last citizenship ceremony of that day. And I ended up going on my own. My wife wasn't able to join. She was traveling, I think, for work or something. And at that point, I just wanted to get it done. I wanted to get my passport and I wanted to register to vote in the upcoming presidential election. And so I was just kind of going to just get it done, right? I was moved to tears by the experience. This is not what I'm planning to talk about tonight, but But I was so moved by it, by the Iraqi family in front of me, the Mexican family behind me, the Afghan family behind me, and just the privilege that it is to be a citizen of this country, and how we have to earn our citizenship, and how important it is, and how precious it is. And I think we're learning how precious it is right now. And it's one of the things that's driving me to my work. So I did, and every single person who became a citizen then went to the League of Women's Voters and signed up to register to vote on that same day. So I'm very proud to say that I cast my vote in that election. Also, because I still have voting rights in the UK, I was able to vote in the Brexit referendum. As a French friend of mine said, for God's sake, don't take French citizenship. I also just want to add my thanks. You've heard the thanks from all the sponsoring organisations, so I won't go through that list again, but I do want to thank all of them. But I have to say, as someone that is lucky enough to be able to speak to audiences like this, getting to this one ahead of the storm and the dedication that was shown to get me here was incredibly flattering and extraordinarily impressive. And so I'm going to do something I've never done before and ask you to give an ovation to Lauren Curry, because yesterday... Sorry, when I say ovation, I mean a standing ovation. Everybody up. It was quite the day, wasn't it?
Yes, it was.
If my wife sees my phone, she's going to be like, who is this Lauren Curry? Why is she telling you where to go? Why is she renting you a car? Why are you in Florida with her? No, she wasn't there, long story. Also, this is obviously a difficult subject. In fact, I wrote down some of the words that we used to describe what I'm about to talk about. Difficult, complicated, challenging, but necessary. I think that's a pretty good summary. And I'm going to go through some charts momentarily, but I'm going to try and frame it, first of all, with the question that everyone has to ask, which is, why would you write another book about this issue? Because after all, although it's a challenging issue, there have been books before. And it's very important to me to show the work that's come before. Hannah Rosen had this book, my big influence on me. She's since had something of a change of heart, but she wrote this book, Atlantic essay of the same title, The End of Men, which actually covered a lot of the issues in higher education that I was able to draw on as well. This was from a more conservative scholar, Kay Heimowitz, which talks more about the cultural issues a couple of years later. This is from Zimbardo and Coulomb, which is more about psychology. This book from Andrew Yarrow, same publishing house as me, Brookings Institution Press, talks more about the labour market, pretty descriptive. The Boy Crisis by Warren Farrell, John Gray. And actually, even since I published my book, another book has been published by the junior senator for Missouri, Josh Hawley. And Senator Hawley has some disagreements with some of what I have to say in my book. And in particular, he disagrees with some of my calls to get more men into teaching and into some of the healthcare professions where there are both jobs and men needed. Because he believes that I'm trying to turn men into something that they're not, rather than create a workplace that suits men. So that's the substantive disagreement between Senator Hawley and I. But I would actually say Senator Hawley has a strong argument as far as it goes. And I'm just going to use as an example here. The Institute is ferociously non-partisan, as am I, and I hope that will become clear over the next few minutes. But what Senator Hawley says is there are some real problems facing boys and men in our society. Mainstream institutions, community foundations, universities, think tanks, governments, are not paying sufficient attention to those problems. That's point number 2. Point number 3, that's because those institutions have been overrun by woke feminists who hate men and want to destroy masculinity and float off to some sort of superwoman utopia. That's point 3. Point 4, that's why you should vote for me, and I'll bring back manufacturing and marriage. Okay, that's the structure of his argument, and it's a very familiar argument from many people who I agree partly with and disagree partly with. Okay, so here's a bit I agree with him. Number 1, there are a bunch of real problems facing boys and men in our society. Absolutely true. Number 2, those issues are not getting sufficient attention from mainstream institutions. True. Number 3, that's because those institutions have been overrun by woke feminists who hate men. Not true, as I think you've just heard. But you can find something on Twitter that makes it sound true, right? You can find some sound bites somewhere and make it sound true. And then as far as number 4 is concerned about bringing back marriage and manufacturing, there are no policy solutions in sight that would do either of those things, even if you wanted to. But the important thing about this message is that whether it's Senator Hawley or other folks online, rather than just dismissing people who make those arguments as just wrong from the get-go, it's very important that we recognize that the starting part of that argument is true. And it is incredibly important that those of us who are in positions to talk about this issue, and to do so in exactly the way that you just heard Joyce describe it, which is in a non-zero-sum way. There are still a huge number of issues that we still need to tackle for women and girls. A gender pay gap, the lack of political representation. Only 25% of members of Congress are women. Obviously, we have yet to have a female president in the US. And I have a wife who is trying to raise money right now from venture capital, so I have to say this one. Only 3% of VC money goes to female founders. The share of women going into tech is actually declining slightly after having risen for a while. There are huge issues that we still have to face and continue to work on to get more women into STEM, more women into politics, more representation, safer public spaces, all on behalf of women. And there are a growing number of issues where we have to pay more attention now to boys and men, including in education, in many areas of mental health, in terms of their ability to be fathers in a radically transformed world. And we have to do both those things at once. Anybody that says we have to choose between them is like someone saying to the parent of a son and a daughter that they're only allowed to care about one of them. It's absurd and it's dangerous and it's leading to this vacuum in our communities, a vacuum in the lives of so many of our boys and men, a vacuum that will get filled. It is an axiom of political and cultural life that if problems go ignored, they turn into grievances. And grievances can be exploited. So if we don't want young men and boys to feel like the only people talking about the issues that are affecting them for real are those who are perhaps on the more reactionary side, whether it's left or right, but more reactionary, then it's up to us. That is our failing, not theirs. And we have to stop blaming them for our failures. So what led me to do this then, to write another book? Well, I think I do a few things differently, and there's a few value statements that I make, and not only to write a book, by the way, but to set up a new think tank, the American Institute for Boys and Men. So the friends of mine who are saying, please don't do this, please don't write about boys and men, you'll never survive it, it's a minefield. You have a decent reputation, you've got a nice sinecure at the Brookings Institution, why on earth would you risk it? And the more people said that, of course, the more I thought, well, I definitely need to write about it. Because if by definition boring people like me aren't allowed to write about it, then who is going to write about it? The non-boring people, right? So I'm here to make a case for being boring. In fact, one of the internal mottos of our new organization is keep it boring. One of my staff just brought me an idea for something I could write about, and I said, nope, not boring enough. Too interesting, I said, and nixed the idea. And so keep it boring is a motto. One of my sons happened to be visiting from college when I was talking to my wife about this, and I said, we've come up with this internal motto, keep it boring. And he looked up from his phone and said, well, you're the right man for that job, Dad. Because he's funny, you know, he's funny like that. But it's something quite serious. So this think tank, the American Institute for Boys and Men, is very new. We are the only institution that exists that focuses on the issues of boys and men. And I see us as in partnership, and we're actually physically in partnership on some issues with many of the institutes that do good work for women and girls. But the lack of there being any kind of dedicated institutional resource or program, some of which you just heard about, just creates an asymmetry. And there was this moment during the pandemic, and some of the data you've just heard speaks to this, a couple of moments during the pandemic when this really, really hit me home. Hit me home. And then I was talking to Ezra Klein about this, and that was the moment the Institute was born. Because during the pandemic, there was a lot of stuff going on. And there were a lot of reports coming out about how the pandemic was potentially affecting women. Many of those fears actually turned out not to be founded, thank goodness. But nonetheless, it was quite right to be ringing the alarm bells around how this pandemic was going to affect women's career advancement, their safety in their homes, their employment, their stress, their mental health as they picked up caring responsibilities. There were lots and lots of reports about that. But then I discovered that male college enrollment in the first year of the pandemic had dropped 7 times more than female college enrollment. A 7-fold difference in the drop in college enrollment. I then noticed that a lot more men were dying of COVID. We lost twice as many prime age men as women to COVID. Huge gender gap in the risk. And it wasn't largely because of behavioral differences. Largely it was because of differences in biological vulnerability. Now, and no one was really talking about that. So why is that? And I thought it's no one's fault. It's just because it's no one's job to be talking about that. It's no one's job to have noticed that 7-fold difference in college enrollment. No one noticed it. Because it was no one's job to be looking at table 2 of that NCES report and noticing the gender gap. Or if it had gone the other way, it would have been someone's job to notice it, and you can bet they would have drawn someone's attention to it, and they would have been quite right to do so. And so that institutional gap is one of the things that led me to do this. Also, I'm a dad. All scholarship is autobiographical. All of it, one way or another. It's just a question whether you admit it or not. So I've got to be honest, like one of the reasons I'm interested in boys is I've got 3. Now they're men. 27, 24, and 22. It keeps changing, but I'm pretty sure that's right. And this is actually us. I was in a trip to North Wales. I'm half Welsh by background. My mother's from North Wales. Welsh is her first language. And we did a trip. We hadn't been there for long. And this photograph is taken in a North Welsh town called Blaenau Ffestiniog, which has a slate mine in it, where the men in my family, and of course it was very male, the men in my family have worked in that slate mine for as long as anyone can remember. And with the help of my great-great-uncle, they found the gravestone of their great-great-great-great-great-grandfather. And they're at an age now where they're kind of understanding that kind of rootedness in that community really meant a lot to them, and to feel part of that community the way they hadn't done before. But I'm very proud of them, and I've had their permission to talk about some of their own struggles through education. And I'll mention one now, which is Bryce, who's the one on the right, as you look up here, who has had serious struggles in the education system. He's just about to graduate from the University of Cardiff, which is where my parents live, not a coincidence. He wanted to be near his 9 and grandpa, 9 being Welsh for grandmother. He wanted to be near them, and it's been a zigzaggy journey through education for him. Guess what he's going to be? A teacher. God bless him. I'm so proud of him. But I tease him too, and I said, so wait, when you were a high school student, you didn't go to high school. But now you want to go every day? As a teacher, you barely turned up when you were actually... But I think that's the nature of things, isn't it? And he had a few teachers who just managed to help him hang on, and not by coincidence, a lot of those were men. And so I think he kind of feels, partly as a result of his own experience, that that's what he wants to do. This is C.P. Scott, the founder of the Guardian newspaper, where, as Dan mentioned, I used to work. And on the newsroom wall, we had this was written up across the newsroom wall in the Guardian office where I work. Comment is free, which is still the name of the Guardian op-ed page, but the second part, facts are sacred. And I think just trying to ground these conversations in the facts, and you've heard some already, is incredibly important. We can then talk about what they mean, why they're happening, etc., but just ground them in the facts as fairly and authoritative as we can. So I'm going to mostly focus on education today. That's what I've been asked to focus on for obvious reasons. And I'm going to briefly mention just a couple of the others. There are charts to come. I'm still a Brookings Institution scholar at heart. I can't really travel without charts. And so I feel like you're a chart-friendly crowd. That's my sense of it, right? If you come to this and you have a president who's an engineer, right? You like charts. And I just need charts for everything. My wife will say, how's your day? But I don't know, what do you mean? Standard deviation, median, mean? Like, what's the scale? Is it a rank ordinal scale? Just follow me on Twitter and then you wouldn't have to keep asking. Just save so much time, wouldn't it? Just follow your spouse on social media. Save half an hour every day. How was your day? Okay, and then I'm going to talk about some things that are quite difficult, including the mental health crisis. So there's a clear mental health crisis playing out, especially among our young people, and it's playing out differently but equally for adolescent boys and girls, and for young men and for young women. And one of the very, very biggest differences is in suicide. Whenever I go and talk on a college campus, and I send my slides in advance, and they see that I'm going to talk about suicide, they say, you should know, we've had a recent suicide. Or one of our alums. And I got to tell you, that's pretty much every time now, right? So there are very few people, very few of us who have not been touched in one way or another by the loss of life to suicide. And so you'll have heard about these rising rates, and here I'm going to show you the rates, suicide rates in 1999 and 2022, so the beginning and the end of these arrows for these different age groups of women, starting with young women, then more middle-aged women and older women. Right? You can see they've gone up for every age group of women in that time period. This is completed suicide as measured by the CDC. And then here's what's happened over the same time period for men. Same start, same finish. And the rate overall is 4 times higher for men than for women. Recent evidence suggests that, especially among the very elderly, there's an even bigger gap. But if you break this chart down, and actually don't do it here, but if you break this chart down, and we do this in a brief that we've published recently, what you see is that since 2010, the rise in suicide has been really focused in the younger age group. So it's this 15 to 24, and then if you break from 25 to 34. Among men in their 20s, suicide's risen by 1/3 since 2010. Now these are rates, so getting our head around that can be quite difficult. So just to put absolute numbers on this, it's about 50,000 lives lost to suicide in the US, so that's 40,000 men. And that's, just to put it in context, about this, we lose about 40,000 women to breast cancer each year. I'm not comparing them in any sort of policy sense. I'm just to give you a sense of the magnitude of this as a public health problem. I think that what's happening around male suicide is an under-acknowledged crisis. It's difficult for us to talk about. It's difficult even for the CDC to acknowledge it. But it is real, and it's playing out in many families and communities right now. It's a big part of our work. And I'm incredibly proud that we played a small part in helping to create an initiative that's been launched by the Bechtel Foundation, a big construction company, with the National Suicide Prevention Foundation, a $7 million project launched last month to look at suicide rates, particularly in the construction industry. That is, of course, almost entirely male, almost entirely working class industry, and has one of the highest suicide rates of any occupation. And to put a number on that, for every construction worker that we lose to an on-site accident on a construction site, for every one of those, we lose 5 to suicide. So we need to pay attention to both sides of that equation in every industry, in every family, and in every community. We're losing too many of our men, especially our young men. But I'm going to focus, as I said, mostly on education here. And this has already been alluded to. So I'm going to give you some national data first, and then we'll drill down a couple of institutions. So the gender gap in college degrees. In 1971-72, that's the academic year, there was a 13 percentage point gap in favor of men. So only 43% of degrees, colleges, 4-year college degrees, I should say, went to women, and 57 went to men. So that's a 13 percentage point gap in favor of men. That's a good year to start with for data reasons, but also it's when we passed Title IX to promote women's educational opportunities, of course. So it's a good data point. The catch-up was rapid. So by the 80s, we'd really seen catch-up. And then the lines, to everyone's surprise, really, just kept going and going. And so there's now a bigger gender gap in terms of degree acquisition, and this is true, as I'll show in a minute, across the board for different kinds of degrees. A slightly bigger gender gap today than there was when we passed Title IX, but the other way around. So we have bigger than Title IX level gender gaps in higher education now, but reversed. And I think it's just incredibly hard for those of us who perhaps went to college or think about the world before this change. Our view of the world is kind of stuck back here, but the needles on the compass have swung around, and suddenly north is south, and it's just incredibly hard to adjust our priors, to update our view of the world for this new world, which is the world that our young men and women are actually living in, because it's not the world we lived in. When you get change this fast, it's hard to update. It's hard because we're still back here. And many of the initiatives that were set up back here. That's why we have some fantastic initiatives for women in higher education. And we should keep them. But they were set up back here, not for this world. And so that's why I'm so pleased to hear that we're now doing more for men. UVM. Now, this is UVM from 2014, where you can see this is the overall enrollment share. So I've already been told that the freshman year is a little bit different and has moved the other way. This is the overall enrollment numbers that we get from the publicly available data. Back in 2014, you can see there was already 55% share women. And this is where we get to now, with a slight improvement in your freshman class, right? So we're just at the point we're getting close to 2/3 female, and then there's been a little bit of a turnaround in kind of recent years. But this is like quite a significant shift. And it also looks like you hit tipping points, and I know that a lot of leaders know this. You get to a certain point where if you skew too far, it gets harder to not only attract men because they see the gender skew, but it gets harder to attract women. I actually speak to a lot of young women who are saying, I actually don't want to go to a college campus where there are twice as many women as men. And they're not necessarily wrong to think that, right? Because of course you go to college to learn and get ready for a career, and acquire life skills, but what else do you go to college for, right? And it turns out that the dating scene is not awesome for women when there's one man for every 2 women. And there's some evidence that actually you're more likely to see the culture around dating shifting in those sorts of environments. So there are all kinds of reasons why you should worry about this as a higher education leader. That's not the main one. You should worry about it for equity reasons and enrollment reasons, but nonetheless, these are striking figures. And then I already mentioned kind of graduation rates, and you're quite right, Suresh has already said that very high rates here. So I'm showing you here men 4-year graduation rates, men 6-year, women 4, women 6. Now, the 6-year rate is the one that most people will look at, back from 2007 up to 2017. That's the entry year. That's the entry in cohort. You can see that there's been an improvement, and these are very high, right, by national standards. A relatively selective institution, you'd expect them to be high. And you can also see there's a pretty big gender gap, right? So if we look at like women's 6-year, men's 6-year, there's a 4-year gap, but then a really big gap in this 4-year thing here, which could partly be about the subject area. I wonder a little bit about that. But what you can see is that there is a 10 percentage point gap in the chances, conditional enrolling, of being done 4 years later between men and women. Now, the more I think about this, if it went the other way, we wouldn't be that surprised, because you'd say, well, look, there are many fewer men going. So you might think there's a selection effect there. You might think of the men going, they're going to be, everything else equal, better prepared and do better. It goes the other way. And in fact, with good controls for everything else, it's arguable that the biggest risk factor of not finishing college or not finishing on time is being male. So this is an enrollment crisis and a completion crisis in roughly equal measure. And it's incredibly important that institutions pay attention to both. Now, why is that happening? And I think I've got your numbers as well, George, but they might be in the wrong place. So let me come back to that if I can find it. But you've already heard the numbers. It's 70% female, and there is a slight graduation gap there as well, but nothing like as stark. But it's been actually strongly female for much longer. It's interesting that in 2 years you saw this overtaking happen even earlier than in 4 years. Now, one of the reasons why you see this gap in higher education is because you see the gap in secondary education. You see this gap in high school, right? In fact, that's the main predictor of what's going to happen in college. And so here what I'm going to show you is high school GPA ranked by decile. So from the bottom 10th to the top 10th. So this is the bottom 10th of students. The poorest performing 10%, ranked by GPA, broken by gender. 2/3 male. So of those right at the bottom of the GPA ladder, 2/3 male. And then this is the rest of the distribution up to the top. The top is 2/3 female. So what that means is that if you're a selective institution, higher education institution, and that's obviously not true for all institutions, but if you are, you're already looking at a pool that's skewed this way, right? And if you're an institution that's less selective, you're already going to be, and you're taking more men, you're going to be taking the men who have not done so well in high school, right? High school GPA is massively skewed, as you can see, especially at the bottom, at the tails. Now, one of the things that's interesting about this is that standardized test scores don't really vary by gender. ACT, SAT, there isn't really a gender gap, especially when you do it by decile. So one of the consequences of that is when colleges go test optional or take tests out altogether, the main effect is to significantly increase their female share. Very good research shows that it increases the female share by 4 percentage points. Now, I'm not saying one shouldn't do that, to be clear. I'm not arguing for or against the policy. I'm just saying that it's a mechanical result that if you take standardized tests out of the admissions process, which is the only bit of the admissions package where boys are holding their own, you will inevitably skew more female, unless you put a big thumb on the scale for the male applicants in order to try and keep something close to gender neutral. So big gap in GPA, not a big gap in standardized tests. What does that tell us? It tells us boys are not smarter than girls and girls are not smarter than boys. Right, I think we can put that one to bed. However, if the girls aren't smarter than the boys, cognitively speaking, why are they killing it on GPA? Well, the answer is because GPA measures other things. Not just intelligence, not just cognitive skills, but non-cognitive skills, organizational skills, future orientation, planning skills, executive functioning, choose your term. That's what GPA rewards. GPA rewards what I call turning in your chemistry homework skills. Are there any chemistry teachers in the room? God damn it. God damn it. Okay, I'll change it. Engineering, physics, chemistry homework. Okay, you want to close it. Turning in your chemistry homework is an incredibly difficult process. I think you'll agree. Well, the men are nodding. Number one, you have to be in class when it's assigned. Big challenge for one of my kids, as I may have already mentioned. Number two, you have to be paying attention in class when it's assigned. That was a big problem for one of the ones that did go. Be paying attention. Number three, make a note of the assignment. Number four, remember later that you have the assignment. Number five, complete the assignment, even though it's a chemistry homework assignment, and so you literally want to do anything else except the chemistry homework. Apologies. Except the chemistry homework assignment. And then, most tragically of all, number six, turn it in. You get through 0.5 and then you forget to turn it in. How do you manage that? So that's a very complicated set of steps. It requires a lot of planning, a lot of organization, etc. Turns out, on the average, girls are ahead on that. Girls do better on that. Are there any neuroscientists in the room? Any scientists, any doctors? Is there a doctor in the house? Okay, thank God, because I'm doing neuroscience. Okay, this shows you, on the average, something that psychologists call impulse control from the age of 10 through 24, 25 at the average, using a scale that I'm not going to pretend I fully understand, but it's Schulman and Steinberg's paper, so I think it's okay. Impulse control is like the brake on a car, like it's what stops you from doing something. And then I'm going to show you sensation seeking, which is like the gas on a car. It's like, go for it, this would be awesome. So sensation seeking is the thing that says, oh, what the hell, you only live once, let's cross state lines and drink that and smoke that, and to hell with homework. To hell with the chemistry homework. Right? What you eat, what you drink, what you do, risk-taking behavior, etc. And what you can see is that this is for girls. There's this kind of period in adolescence where sensation seeking really peaks, right? 14. So that's why everything feels a little bit more sensation, everything's more exciting. And your impulse control is dipping a little bit at that point, so it's kind of harder to say no, it's harder to make yourself do the thing you kind of want to do. In other words, adolescence is a bit of a tough period, right? All of human life is about the balance between the gas and the brake, impulse control and sensation seeking. If we were all impulse control, we would be incredibly dull, we'd never do anything interesting. But if we were all gas, we'd have very risky and unsuccessful lives. So it's about the balance between the two. And as you can say, adolescence, tough time, even for girls. Now let's do boys. Boys impulse control, boys sensation seeking. And so this has all kinds of implications. So you can see, I think you'll agree with me, that there's a bigger gap here and here at the average. And really it's in these critical years here where you see it. This has all kinds of consequences. One of the reasons that we lose twice as many boys who actually die from risk-taking activities in adolescence. Adolescent death rates are twice as high for boys as for girls. So there's all kinds of difficulties with that. But it's also just, it comes down to things as more straightforward as doing your homework, right? It's hard to plan ahead. It's hard to have those chemistry homework skills, non-cognitive skills. And so one of my colleagues who's, I would describe her as a very, very scholarly, very progressive, strong feminist. She read my book in review and she gave me great comments. And in this section where I went through these differences, she has a son and a daughter, and she just went, well, duh. She literally wrote, well, duh. I don't need a Brookings Senior Fellow to tell me this. I have a son and a daughter. Well, duh. And you're probably going like, okay, he has charts, but tell me something I didn't know. Really? You need a PhD to tell me that there's a difference? Okay. So it's a well, duh fact, but it's a fact that we completely ignore in our education policy, except in private schools and some higher economic areas where it's become very common for boys to start school a little bit later, to give them a chance to developmentally catch up, which is something I'll come on to in a moment. The other thing that's already been alluded to, and thank you so much for mentioning this, I think it was Joyce that mentioned this, the declining share of men in teaching. So in 1980, when Ronald Reagan came to office, this is the male share of K-12 teachers. It was 33% of our K-12 teachers were male. Now it's 23%. And it's ticking down now. It's not a dramatic drop now, but it's ticking down. Every time the report comes out, it goes down and barely gets mentioned. One of the things I'm trying to change. And the thing about 23% is that it's not just 10 percentage points less than 33%. It obviously is that. But it's also past a sort of tipping point where a profession starts to feel quite gendered. There's work from Jessica Pan and others that shows that once you get below 30% gender representation, it gets harder to persuade someone that's a career for them. And most of this work is drawn from very good research on women into male professions. Like if you're going to be one of only 20% of women engineers, it's just harder than if you're going to be one of 35% of women engineers. And it looks like about that third point is when it starts to feel like okay, right? You're not going against the grain so much. And so I'm worried that we're at a tipping point now where it's getting harder and harder. So when I was considering becoming a K-12 teacher, I wasn't going against the grain back in the 80s. My son is. And is facing some stigma as a result of that. That's how the world has changed, where it's just becoming less and less common. Especially at younger ages. So like this is post-secondary now, we're at 50-50. High school dropping, but still 45% male. Middle school, less than a third. Elementary school, it's about 10% male. And pre-K, find me a male pre-K teacher, and you've got something close to a unicorn. It barely exists, about 2 or 3%, depending on how you measure it. In fact, as a kind of stylized fact here, there are twice as many women flying US fighter planes as men teaching kindergarten, as a share of the profession, right? It's about 7% of our fighter pilots are women now. But the reason why it's interesting to me is not just because, I don't think 7% is high enough, by the way, but the US military is spending millions of dollars redesigning their fighter planes. They're redesigning the ejector seats because the ejector seats were made for male hips. Women don't fit in them very well. So they're literally designed with male biology in mind, right? And so sorry, women can't fly fighter planes. Why not? Because they don't fit in the seats. And also you can't look over the thing. It also excluded shorter men. But they actually don't fit in the ejector seats. So we've redesigned all the seats. At the cost of millions of dollars, every single dollar of which I support, and we should keep doing more of that. I just suggest respectfully that we should have some equivalent efforts on getting more men into our pre-K classrooms. As Gloria Steinem said, it really matters. People believe their eyes, not their ears. And we've spent a long, long time saying women can do everything men can do. True. How much time have we spent saying men can also do what women can do? And so I see this as a crisis. And then if we break by race, and we're the first people to do this in a recent report, it's a very common thing to look at what does the K-12 student population look like by comparison to the K-12 teacher profession look like by race. But what we did was we did it by race and gender. So what this tells you is that for every 5 female students, there's 1 white female students, there's 1 white female teacher. So a 1 in 5 ratio if you do by race and gender, white female to white female. It's much worse for black girls, gets to 10, Asian girls, and especially Hispanic girls. And one of the reasons for that is that the Hispanic population skews very young. So there's just going to be a lot more young Hispanic US citizens than there are in the workforce. But this is men. So best represented boys, white boys, 17, black, Asian, Hispanic. So the best represented boys are white boys, as you would expect, but they're still slightly less well represented than the least well represented girls, so Hispanic girls. And then look at what happens by race here. So I strongly believe that representation matters, and it matters both by race and gender. And so if you agree with me, then you've got to look at these numbers and think that we should be very careful about our teacher pipeline and who we're attracting into teaching. And we should have very significant efforts to be getting more men, especially men of colour, into teaching, but men generally. I promised I would just say a couple of things about these other 2 areas before I conclude and we go to Q&A. But I think they're all related. Wages and work. You'll have heard that there's been an increase in earnings inequality, and it's much of my previous work on the middle class and dream hoarders has been around this issue. What this shows you is the female wage distribution and the male wage distribution in 1979 and 2019. And so what this is telling you is in 1979, the female wage distribution looked pretty different to the male wage distribution. You can see the top chart there, it skews very to the left, women earning a lot less than men. And in 1979, only 13% of women earned more than the median man in the middle of the distribution. Fast forward 2019, the lines look much more similar. This is full-time workers, same as we use for the gender pay gap. Much, much closer together. Not a complete catch-up, but much closer. And so now 40% of women earn more than the median man. That's not equality. It would have to be 50% to be equality. But 40% is a lot higher than 13%. And that distribution looks a lot different. The other thing that's happened is that the distribution has flattened and gone to the right. What that's telling us is higher income men and women are doing a lot better than working class men and women, and that's what the data shows us. The other thing that's happened in the labour market, and this alludes to something I was saying earlier, is hands up who's heard of the term STEM. STEM, S-T-E-M, hands up, all the way up, so I can just check, okay, fine, yeah, everybody, okay. You wouldn't have heard of the term STEM if it wasn't for a woman at the National Science Foundation called Judith Rameley, who came in and she was given, as one of her tasks, she was given the job of promoting SMET. She said, what the hell's SMET? And they said, science, math, what is it again, Bob? Engineering, and what's it? Tech, I don't know, something. I know, can you promote that for us? And she's like, no. Can I call it STEM? They said, sure, whatever. Call it whatever you want, Judith, just promote it. So she renamed it STEM. And the rest is history. Within a couple of years, there was a congressional caucus, and now you're all putting your hand, you've all heard of it, science, technology, engineering. We've done a huge amount to promote more women into STEM. We've tripled the share of women in STEM. There's a lot more to go, a lot more work to do. But these are the professions I call the HEAL professions: health, education, and either arts or administration. I haven't quite decided that one yet, and literacy skills. And here are some examples of these professions. And the share of men over time since 1980. Now, the purple line here, which I've already referred to, is teachers. That's K-8 teachers, gone from 40% down to nearly 20%. Nursing has gone up a little bit. Actually, quite a lot of migrant men have come in. We see a lot of from overseas filling these nursing roles, but nonetheless, nursing has gone up a little bit. And then I want to draw your attention to psychology, the top line, and social work, the orange line. So these two critical mental health professions are becoming female professions. They weren't, but now they are. And again, not something I think is getting enough attention. If the line for psychology kept going down, we wouldn't have a single male psychologist by 2046. That won't happen. The lines don't work like that. That's a fallacy, the straight line fallacy. That won't happen, but it does help to illustrate the point that these professions have become it. Now, not for nothing, also flat pay and very high levels of education qualification for those. Get into schools and universities, even more female. Now remember the first chart I showed you and the difficulty some men have asking for help. Everything else equal, is it going to be easier or harder in some cases for men to get help if there are literally no men in their counselling service or in the mental health profession? I was glad to be able to get a male therapist. I was very glad to get one of my sons a male therapist. Not always important, but sometimes that's important. Representation matters. And I'm really worried that just as we might be inadvertently sending the signal that educational success codes female teachers, girls doing much better, the idea of mental health could end up being coded female too. Females in the profession, it's something that women feel more able to talk about. That makes it harder and harder for men to talk about their own mental health problems. So I think this is another crisis. And if we're serious about mental health, we're serious about representation. And I've got to tell you, I'll run the risk of saying this. If these lines looked like this and it was the other way round, in terms of gender representation, I really think you'd know about it. I don't think we'd be sanguine about these professions becoming entirely male. Should we be sanguine about them becoming entirely female? I don't think so. And so we should be having huge efforts to get invested in this. And one of the problems is that because we code some of these issues as kind of more female than male, we inadvertently build into public policy some mistakes. And I'll give you one example I just encountered recently. We're picking up more anxiety among teen girls recently, as you've probably noticed from the press. One reason for that is since 2012, screening for anxiety for girls and women has been fully covered without cost under the Affordable Care Act. Big breakthrough. But not for boys and men. It's not because the Obama White House was overrun with woke feminists who hate men. Okay, just to be clear. It's because the way that preventive healthcare services was set up created a whole arm for women and girls, which is doing great work, no equivalent for boys and men because, they don't need it. The whole medical system is for boys and men. I don't think that's true. And I think as a result of that, we're missing a lot of mental health problems in our boys and men because we don't screen for it and we don't screen for it in the right way. And then we watch our professions that are catering to these needs crater the share of men. So I think this is another crisis too. And then I'll just do this very quickly. We already mentioned fatherhood, but this is the share of children born outside marriage to college-educated mothers, gone from 5% to 11% since 2019. So it's doubled, but a very low base. That's not where the story is. The story is for everybody else. This is for those with a 2-year college degree or less. This is for those with less than high school. 40% of kids born outside marriage. Most of the kids born to those without a 4-year college degree are born outside marriage. 70% of black kids born outside marriage. So, solution, bring back marriage. George Bush tried that, didn't work. Even if you wanted to, you can't. Gloria Steinem said, the point of the women's movement is to make marriage a choice and not an economic necessity. It is to free women from the economic dependency that was represented by marriage. And by God, that was a great goal. And we're not there yet, but we've made great progress. One consequence of that is to put a big question mark as to what does it mean to be a father? If it's no longer head of household, main breadwinner, which it isn't and shouldn't be, what is it? And what's the message that we're sending to men about their role as fathers? There's a real danger right now that on the left, and I'm sometimes accused of this, on the left, saying dads really matter, which is what I think the social science said, is to be heteronormative, is to be against single parents or against same-sex couples. I don't think that's true, and I can say why in Q&A, if you like. So even raising the issues of fathers is seen as somehow suspect on the political left. Meanwhile, on the political right, it's like, yes, dads matter, that's why they all have to be married. Meanwhile, the rest of us are just trying to make it work, right? And we've got to find a way to say dads matter, period. Not dads matter if they earn or they're married or whatever. Just dads matter. And I don't think we're doing a good enough job of that either. So I promised some solutions, so I'll put a few up just to get the questions rolling in. I really welcome challenges, by the way, around all this stuff, because it's a difficult and challenging and complicated discussion, as we've already heard. Let's start boys in school a bit later. Could we please have some more technical high schools? Like we've already heard about the fact that actually boys just on average can learn a little bit more differently, but we don't. We underinvest in vocational training in this country. I have a son that, God, he really struggled at school, hated it, didn't see the point of it, but he could come home and rip our refrigerator apart in ways that terrified me and then put it back together again, working again. Right. Just finding ways to respect those. Could we have some more apprenticeships? The fact that the US is at the bottom of the OECD league table for apprenticeships is bad, period. It's especially bad for men because it turns out apprenticeships are a really good way to help young men. Not in any way to say that we don't need more traditional routes of higher education, but we need these as well. We need to do both because they're especially good for boys and men. I hope I've made the case that we should have more male teachers. How about Ronald Reagan era share of male teachers, 1 in 3? Every school district, every school, every state should set the goal of 1 in 3 of our teachers being men. That means scholarships. That means outreach programs. That means concerted effort. But it's worth it. Every college campus should have a men's resource center or similar. There are women's resource centers on almost every college campus, and some of them are being knocked down by Title IX complaints being brought against them by men who say they're sexist because there's no equivalent for men. And guess what? They're winning some of those lawsuits. So rather than get rid of the women's center under the threat of a lawsuit, how about creating one for men? Do both. Think 2 thoughts at once. I do think that the world's ready for this. We can do both. And some places are now doing it. And UVM has a male coordinator now working out of the gender center on that. I've already mentioned HEAL jobs, including education. Let's have scholarships for men. Just for men, into these courses, into these professions. Just for men? Yes. Should we keep all the ones that we have into STEM just for women? Yes. That's my view. Some people say get rid of all of them. We don't need more scholarships for women into STEM anymore. That's outrageous and sexist. No, we've got more work to do on female representation in STEM. But can we add some for men in HEAL? And if not, why not? Why is one of those okay and not the other? Because I really think representation matters in those fields. And by the way, equal paid leave for fathers, independent, available paid leave. I propose 6 months each. Fathers get 6 months, mothers get 6 months of paid leave at any time in their child's life. And people read the draft of my book and they said, 6 months? What are you, European? Well, actually, now you mention it. Yes, it's utopian, but guess what? Since I published the book, the US military has introduced 3 months of paid leave for fathers and mothers, independent and separate. Good for them. But what's good enough for the US military? And by God, it is good enough for the US military. They deserve every day of that leave. What about civilians too? I think they've set a great precedent. If the US military can do it for their dads, then by God, we can do it for the rest of our dads too. These are wonky solutions maybe, but I hope you can tell from the way I'm talking about this, I think the stakes are pretty high. We can't afford to lose this debate. We can't afford to lose our men. We cannot afford to cede this ground to people who will use the legitimate problems of boys and men to turn them into grievances to threaten our institutions. We've got to make our boys and men know that we see them, we hear them, we've got these problems, and we're addressing them in a non-zero-sum way, and we've got to do it now. Time is not on our side. There's an urgency to this task. That's why it's my mission, and I hope you'll join me. Thank you. And by the magic of technology, you can text your question to me. And then someone will read it out.
So we do have a good window for Q&A, so if you text questions to this number, I'll tee them up for Richard. I'm just going to start with, I think, one of the questions that's front of mind for me and front of mind for, I imagine, for a lot of people in the audience is, how do you have this conversation without it feeling like without it feeling anti-woman?
By not being anti-women is a good starting point, and I say that semi-jokingly, but because actually a lot of the people having this conversation are anti-women. Right? They dominate the conversation very often, and which is why I think we do need to be in it. But I also think it's by framing it in a certain way. I think we have to start off, I think, by saying how much more there is still to do on a lot of fronts for women and girls, and then do the and. Because otherwise people think, where are you going with this? They worry that it's going in a reactionary direction. And then I think speak to the facts. It's really hard to dispute facts. And just say, okay, facts. And we might disagree with them. You know, some people will say it doesn't matter that women are further ahead in college because they have a harder time in the labour market. Right? They need more education in order to kind of beat the patriarchal labour market. That's a good discussion. Happy to have that discussion. But the facts don't lie. So let's kind of lead with those. And I think also just kind of lead with compassion. One of the best interviews I had actually was the one with Ezra Klein. And he said sometimes it feels like people are worried that there's sort of a limit on how much compassion there is to go around. One of the nice things about compassion and empathy is there is no limit on them. We don't have to show any less compassion or empathy for the problems of women and girls to show compassion and empathy for the problems of boys and men. So that's how I approach it.
So related is the first question that's been submitted is how do you take the first step how does somebody take the first step in their own circle of talking about the experience of men and boys, or how to teeing it up for a discussion in their community? Vermont is a state made up of small communities. We're talking neighbor to neighbor all the time. How do you tee it up? How do you recommend it?
Well, you're doing it. I mean, I honestly felt to some extent like you almost didn't need me tonight. I mean, I'm thrilled to be here, don't mistake me, but so much of the work had already been done by everything that had been said beforehand. Here you have leaders in the community talking about this issue, right? So, and you're modeling how to do about it, non-zero sum, continuing to do the work we need to do. And from a position where people trust you. So I think it's incredibly important this is kind of trusted people, trusted leaders, people who you know are only going to be doing it for reasons of opportunity and equity and so on. So that's how I would start with it. But, and then start with the facts, gather the facts, share the facts. And then see how that goes. And just, I think one of the things I've noticed is a lot of the people who get into this field, they look at the issues of boys and men, they find a bunch of problems, and then they find that they're not being addressed properly. I'll give you an example. A men's rights activist is on the telephone with me and he says, they don't care about male suicide. Okay. I said, let's break this down. Who's they, and why do you say they don't care? They, government. Okay, and why do you say they don't care? He says, I've emailed you a link. Click on the link. Click on the link. It is the link to the CDC page on suicide disparities, with all the major disparities in suicide. There's a great bit on veterans and non-veterans. There's a great bit on LGBTQ. There's a great bit on rural-urban. There's a great bit on occupation. They're really good. Guess what's not there? Gender, the male gap. No mention of the higher risk of male men. So even though that is much bigger than any of the other gaps, that is not to diminish the importance of those other gaps. So I'm just like, put the phone on mute, cursing the CDC, asking them, are they working for the men's rights movement, right? And so just by acknowledging, I don't think we can underestimate, I always get that wrong. I think it's incredibly important that just the mere fact of naming these problems as being real is powerful. It's incredibly powerful culturally. I think so much of the success of many of the guys who are online around this stuff is that they just make a lot of these young men feel like someone saw them and someone heard them. And it's just a tragedy that it takes them to do that rather than us. So I think if we do all that, then I think we've got a good chance of a better conversation. I hope you're going to pick the really, really hard ones.
Thank you. We're getting a bunch of nice submissions. Keep them coming. Just trying to figure out if we can combine a couple. Let's see. What has been, you hinted at it just a moment ago, but how would you characterize the political response to rolling out the Institute, your book?
I'm aware that I've got 2 microphones on me right now, haven't I? So I have to be careful. No, I don't have to. What the hell? I think the problem right now is that at a national level, there's very little interest on the political left in policies to help boys and men. And there's very little interest on the political right in policies. So if you're trying to advocate for policies for boys and men at a national level, it's a very difficult time. And the reason that people on the left are so worried about it is because they think, in my view, wrongly, that by raising the issues of boys and men, especially working class boys and men and of colour, that will somehow undermine their credibility as advocates for women, and they think they've got to go all in on the women's vote. I think they're wrong about that. I think that women are perfectly capable of understanding where their interests are and saying, by the way, you want to help working class men. I'll give you an example. The infrastructure bill helped working class men. 2/3 of the beneficiaries are working class men. We know that because a women's group did the analysis. Would the administration say that? No. Pete Buttigieg was interviewed by Joy Reid on MSNBC, and she said, isn't this just a bill for white men, the infrastructure bill? What he should have said was, no, actually, Joy, it is for working class men, but disproportionately Hispanic and black working class men, because they're overrepresented in some of the industries that will be helped, construction and transit to be exact. But yes, you're right, this bill will help working class men. Here are all the things the administration is doing to help women. But you know what, Joy? I don't think it's so terrible. We have a piece of legislation that helps working class men of all colours in this country. Working class men haven't had a great ride of it over the last few decades. So you seem to be saying it's a bad thing this helps working class men. I think it's a great thing this helps working class men. He couldn't say that. What he said was, women use bridges as well. Or something to that effect. It's very unusual poor performance from Pete Buttigieg, who I love, by the way. And yet, over on the right, you've got people like Josh Hawley and all the others who, like, I've mentioned him already. He's saying, I'm going to bring back marriage manufacturing. I'm for the working man, right? I'm on the side of the working man against these woke feministas. Guess who didn't vote for the infrastructure bill? Senator Josh Hawley. The only major piece of legislation we've had in recent years that will help working class men. So between those two poles, it's very difficult. That said, at a state level, at a local level, a gubernatorial level, a school district level, that's where the action is. And there we're getting a much, much better response.
Thank you. A technical question that just got submitted. You know, if you redshirt boys, that adds one more year of childcare. We know who tends to bear the burden of childcare responsibilities. How do you navigate that? How do you navigate the added expense? How would you respond to that?
Yeah, well, the first thing is that since I wrote the book and said we should hold boys back for a year, somebody pointed out to me that it doesn't have to be a whole year, it could just be 4 months. I said, wait, how does that work? And they said, well, just have different start dates. You're an idiot. It's like, I'm an idiot. You could do September 1 and January, right? So, and actually it's the summer-born boys who benefit most, and so I've revised my proposal now. It doesn't have to be a year, it needs to be. So you'd have a different start date. But it's very important that I combine that proposal with extra investment in pre-K. And that actually it only works if the boys are in quality pre-K for longer. And that's also, it only works then from an equity point of view too, otherwise it'll put a greater childcare burden on the very parents whose sons are the ones who will benefit most from the extra time in pre-K. So the policy only works from an equity point of view if you simultaneously invest in quality pre-K and maybe hold the boys back for between 4 and 6 months in that quality pre-K. This is not just them staying at home. If you didn't have that in place, I would not advocate for the policy.
Thank you. Great question just submitted. What are the lessons from the women's movement that can be applied in this context as we think about changing the trajectory of men and boys in education and society?
No. There's a couple of things I would say. Number one is the women's movement, along with some other justice movements, some other liberation movements, really helped, I think, to draw attention to structural factors and institutional factors rather than individual ones. I think one of the big claims of the women's movement correctly was we shouldn't fix the women, we should fix the systems. Now, that wasn't an easy fight always. There was a period, I'm old enough to remember the 1980s, where there was a kind of danger that the women's movement was actually becoming much more individualistic, right? Shoulder pads, do you remember them? I'm not saying they've gone away altogether, but like shoulder pads, voice training to deepen your voice, assertiveness training, stand in a funny way. In other words, the message was in danger of becoming to women, if you want to succeed, you'll have to become like a man. Act like a man, look like a man, dress exactly. And then enough women just went, well, screw that. Thank you very much. I would like to have the equal opportunities to be CEO or president or whatever, but I don't have to put on funny clothes or change my voice. Thank you very much. Maybe the problem that women have is not that they talk funny or wear the wrong clothes. It's that we don't have structures that allow them to combine work and care, that we have incredibly family-friendly structures, that we have cultures that are female and friendly. Maybe we need to change the institutions, not the women. Maybe we need to make workplaces women-friendly rather than make women workplace-friendly. Great insight. Not saying it's over, more to do. We have to do the same thing for boys. There is a danger in the education system, for example, or even in mental health, that we fall into that individualistic trap, that we say, what's wrong with boys? We try and fix the boys. We treat boys in schools like malfunctioning girls. Right? What's wrong with you? Why aren't you more like your sister? I said that to my boys, and they don't have a sister. I had an imaginary sister who would do all the things that I wish they would do. Right? So there's this tendency, rather than saying, hold on, why is given those gaps, what is it about the education system that's not working well enough for boys? That's the question we should be asking, not what's wrong with boys and fixing them. By the way, 23% of boys in K-12 education have now been diagnosed with a developmental disability. 23%. I'm sorry. Really? Now, that suggests strongly to me that it's not the boys who are disabled, but the system's not serving them very well, right? And that systematic approach to the women's movement, I think, has been incredibly powerful. And then the other thing I would say is there was something, and remains something. I was lucky enough to spend some time with Gloria Steinem recently, and at 90, she still has this. There was something wonderfully positive and optimistic and empowering and uplifting about the women's liberation movement at its best, right? It's about potential and flourishing and opportunity, and she still has that. And I just think that positive energy, we want that as well. Too much right now of the discourse around men is kind of pissed off men, grievances, men's rights, etc. It's very kind of loss-based, rather than just kind of how awesome it is and how great things can be. And so if we could capture some of that optimism that I think animated the women's movement, that would help us as well.
Another question that's come in, this is a very binary conversation in an environment where we're opening our eyes broadly to the conditions affecting non-gender binary Vermonters and Americans and others. So how do you create space and center the experience of non-binary individuals in this discussion? Yeah, so I think the first thing to say is that the rise of the people that challenge the binary, that certainly by identifying as non-binary, or perhaps by transitioning, which of course very, very different things that we shouldn't conflate. Because in many ways, of course, trans individuals are very often the ones who are most insistent on the binary, for good reason. And so to the extent that there are people who are challenging all of that, I completely welcome that. I think that's amazing, because I think it's just like a sign of a society that can just be more chill about people identifying themselves in different ways, and we should respect everybody. It's also true that that's not most people, right? The vast majority of people still identify with their natal birth, and that's also fine. And it's about, again, this tested two things at once. I fear that in this debate sometimes, we fall into the trap of thinking that to give due respect to the relatively small number of exceptions, and honor those, which we should, we have to abolish the rule, right? That somehow, in order to properly pay respect to those who perhaps transcend the binary or cross the binary, we have to pretend there is no such thing as a difference at all. And I think that's just wrong. And we can do both those things at once. And for the moment anyway, there are sufficient numbers of people who identify
as male or female in line with their natal birth, as to still be doing incredibly useful work for us as social scientists. Maybe that will change, but I've got to tell you, for the moment, I'm very comfortable putting up these charts, and over time, we'll have to say that there'll be some people who identify as neither or non-binary on those charts as we get better data. Great. The same will happen with the gender pay gap, by the way. In order to measure the gender pay gap, we have to be very binary. We have to find out what women earn and what men earn and compare it. It's incredibly binary. I still think it's very useful to know what women earn by comparison to men in order to try and find ways to narrow that gap and improve it. Again, maybe that won't be true for long. Maybe the very idea of measuring the gender pay gap will start to seem absurd. I think we're a very, very long way from that. I suspect we'll never get there. But it doesn't mean that we can't also include in our data and in our discourse the people who don't conform to those. We can honour the exceptions without obliterating the rule.
Thanks. A question just submitted. How do you see the role of single gender community resources, camps, experiences, programs, things like that?
Yeah, well, I've actually written a little bit about this. The case for some male spaces. It was interesting because I'd just written that and I went back to the UK where we still have some clubs, some old London clubs that are all male. The Garrick Club was just in the news, and the head of MI6 and someone else had to resign from the Garrick Club. And then I went on TV to talk about the case for male spaces. And I was like, I don't mean the Garrick Club. And it's a kind of serious point because I actually think there's a suspicion about all male spaces, which is a legitimate suspicion, which is based on the fact that they were used as places where power was exchanged, where favors were exchanged, where stuff happened, especially in a professional environment, that excluded women. So it was a real barrier to women's advancement if there were these kind of the old boys network, to use that language for it. And so I think in those professional settings, that suspicion is still legitimate. But I don't think we should read across from that to say that means all male spaces are de facto suspicious or bad. I think the opposite. I think particularly for boys and young men, having some spaces that are single sex, all male, again, to go back to the binary, is a good thing. I think it's a place where they can express themselves differently. It's a space where they're going to communicate differently, just as it is for girls. And so to give you an example, I think that the fact that Boy Scouts of America has gone co-ed, whilst Girl Scouts remain single sex, is a bad idea. And I think we'll look back on it and say, that was a bad idea. Boy Scouts of America have rebranded themselves BSA in the hope that everyone forgets what the B stood for, like IBM. Who knows what the I and the B are? Some people probably don't. All right, eventually. And so actually the full title of the organization now is Scouts BSA. So it's the full name of the organization is Scouts, Boy Scouts of America. That's its full name. That's just bad writing. But I know what they're doing, right? So they have girls in there now. And I think we'll just look back and say, no, like that was a moment where we don't want the Garrick Club, and we don't want old boys networks, and we don't want men sort of giving away promotions on the all-male golf weekend, whatever. That doesn't mean we have to kill Boy Scouts or boys clubs or those other spaces. I actually think we do need those spaces, and we need them for girls too, as well as lots of co-ed spaces.
Thanks. I'm going to read this one. You know, as a parent of young kids who spend a lot of time thinking about how to get every conversation right, so I want to respect this question. I've spent a lot of time building up my daughter, and with that, my 6-year-old son wonders where he stands, saying at one point, "What about boys? How do we build up boys at home?"
I'm going to do a little plug first. I was really happy about this. There's this publishing house that's bringing out a book aimed at middle schoolers called She Can STEM, with 50 biographies of women in science, technology, engineering, and math. Beautiful pictures, biographies, etc. They reached out to me, and we're now doing one on boys into HEAL. Same publisher, same aim at middle schools to try and get boys. So 50 biographies of men in those other professions, right? So I'm a co-author with a National Teacher of the Year, Jonathan Jurovich, who's done, frankly, most of the work, most of the writing and the interviewing. It's a beautiful book. I'm so happy about that. But I honestly think that if we weren't having this conversation, and maybe even immodestly, if I hadn't kind of just taken a bit of a leap with it, I don't think they would have thought of it, maybe. They wouldn't have thought to do that. But the very fact they thought to do it and they're now doing it is great. So number one is, let's just be really careful not to treat our boys like malfunctioning girls. What's wrong with you? Why aren't you more like your sister? First, do no harm. Don't pathologize. Right? It's one of the reasons why I'm strongly against the use of the term toxic masculinity, because of whether you like it or not, that just sends a negative message to boys. Right? And recognize there will be some differences in there. So don't do harm, don't pathologize, don't have a kind of inadvertent female standard you're holding them to, or the other way around for your daughter. And I think the other thing is just open up the space for the conversation. Say, how do you feel about that, etc. I was at an event recently where a woman said, she has a few kids, and she said, I've actually got a trans kid now who's transitioned and is now a boy. She said, so I've gone from trying to raise a powerful woman to trying to raise a feminist ally man. And I said, really? I mean, I'm not saying you shouldn't be, but it's just, that's what you see for your son. It's just not enough. And so I think just having the sort of same spirit of kind of energy and positivity that we have towards girls and women, we have to have it for our boys as well. So I think it's in the affect, and it's just in the framing we do. I'm not sure I got this right myself completely, but I've been really struck by how many people, when they think about this, they think about, particularly if they come at this with very progressive credentials, they kind of think, yeah, maybe I am inadvertently sending a message to my son that's based on the world that he's not experiencing, and the one that I experience rather than the one he is experiencing now. And so I just think a bit of empathy and a bit of compassion, and don't have nothing off limits. I think that's the other thing, is that I've discovered a lot of boys are afraid to even raise some of these issues or some of the content they're consuming online, with their mums especially, because they think that she'll be furious. So they just talk to their friends about it. So I think depathologizing is step one.
So last question, and then I'm going to turn the microphone over to Lauren, but relating to the online experience, how do you see video games, social media, and other influences playing out in terms of the experience of boys in this, when it comes to this gap and the influences that are there?
Yeah, it's really interesting this. I mean, Jonathan Haidt, Jean Twenge, and others have got work out on this, of course. Jonathan Haidt is co-chair of our advisory council at the American Institute for Boys and Men, and has written a piece for us on why I'm worried about boys as well, which I recommend to all of you. And he has a whole chapter in his new book looking at boys, which is big because he's made, I think, he's drawn a lot of attention correctly to the issues of teen girls and social media. And interesting, I think the way that social media and the internet is kind of playing out on average for teen girls and boys and young men and women is not just different, but in some ways diametrically opposite. Girls are much more likely to be on Instagram, TikTok, relational kind of forms of social media, and the real problems there are rising issues of body image problems, because they're very visual, of course, and so there's constant image stuff that you're supposed to look like this, and that's incredibly dangerous, especially for teen girls. And we see huge rise in eating disorders and self-harm, I think, as a result of that. The second thing is it's very relational. And on the average, there's no difference between the tendency of girls and boys to bully each other. It's just that girls tend to do it more relationally rather than physically. So there's the stereotype is the classic kind of mean girls phenomenon. And so there's exclusion and there's ostracism and they're kind of who's in, who's out, friends, etc. And girls can be quite vicious about that in just the same way boys can, in a different way. And the trouble with that form of social media is it just amplifies that. So it amplifies relational bullying, and that can lead to real problems for the girls who feel like they're on the wrong side of that. That sense of social status that comes from social media for girls is huge. Boys are less likely to be on those forms of social media. They're more likely to be gaming, obviously more likely Reddit, YouTube, etc. And my view about and pornography. My view about most of that, and not everyone likes me saying this, is that in and of themselves, I don't see that much direct harm from those forms of content. What I see is indirect harm because it's displacing other kinds of activity, particularly in real life friendships and in real life relationships. So it's not what boys are doing online that's the problem, it's what they're not doing while they're online. And that's one reason I think we see this huge friendship recession, especially among kind of young men. Now, of course, social media can be good for friendship connection, but that in real life friendship connection actually can't replace all of that online. So it's not for nothing that 15% of men under 30 say they don't have a close friend now. That's 15% up from 3% in 1990. And so I think this kind of isolating effect, and if we add to that this sense that a lot of men kind of feel like, I'm not quite sure how to be in the world. I've got a long list of don'ts. I know exactly what not to do. I'm not quite sure what to do, maybe especially with regard to women. But there's a kind of sense of retreat. And I think the forms of internet content and social media that men tend to is more a kind of retreat. And so what I would worry about if I'm thinking about girls and young women is, what are you doing online? Which apps are you on? Because I think they're directly harmful. And with boys, I'd be more like, what are you not doing while you're doing that? Rather than that's directly harmful. And so I think that even there, it's kind of modulating the amount of time that they're on, because there's no replacement for in real life. I think there's a bit of a moral panic around some of the gaming stuff and the porn stuff, which is not justified by the evidence. I think there's a moral panic around some of the social media stuff for girls, which is justified by the evidence. The moral panic around boys should be, are we squeezing them out of real life? And honestly, if you feel like you're not sure you're going to succeed and compete well and get status in the real world, and you're not sure how things are going to work out romantically, and you do have these great alternatives, you might retreat to those. But it's incredibly important we don't pathologize that. I think some of the debates around this have a real tendency to be like, well, if they would just get off their backsides and stop smoking weed and looking at porn and video gaming all the time, they'd be fine. Right? We individualize it back to them again. We blame them again, rather than saying, what is it about our society that makes those alternatives more attractive? Maybe we should look a bit harder at ourselves as well, rather than blaming them for it. And I don't want to get into that blame game at all. Plus, anybody that hasn't completed Far Cry 5 with their son or friend hasn't lived. Let's be honest. I mean, some of these games are just amazing, and boys and young men get a huge amount of pleasure and enjoyment and connection out of them. And so let's not take one of the things that is good for them and make it something we beat them over the head with. Instead, let's just say, as long as you're doing it with other things as well, no problem, go for it, because it's great fun. My youngest son is now replaying some zombie game. Which one? I did a zombie game with his college mates, and they do it in their friend. It's fine. And then they go out and they do something else. Wonderful. Don't fall into the trap of blaming men for their own plight. And don't use video games or porn or anything else, or Andrew Tate or toxic masculinity or something else to kind of bash them over their heads and blame them for their own problems. Instead, look at college graduation, look at employment, look at what's happening in the real world. Be on their back. Be behind them. There's too many wagging fingers. Not enough helping hands. The power of a helping hand, that's all they need. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Richard. What a beautiful sentiment to end on. Thank you all again for coming out on this beautiful Vermont spring day. I know that at my house we had something like 20 inches of snow today. And as you heard, I'm a bit of a worrier, so it was a great morning for me. I just want to say that one of the real virtues of doing the Q&A in this way is that we're not going to lose your questions. We got to some, but there were incredible questions asked from the audience today, and we get to hang on to them. And for me, our whole investment in this project has been about the conversation itself. I want us to learn more about what's happening, and I want us to learn better ways to talk about it. And so for me, these questions are an incredibly potent kind of moment in that conversation. And I am excited to say that in a practical way, this is a starting point, because the Tarrant Foundation and the Vermont Community Foundation have partnered to produce a documentary film. And we are working with some wonderful videographers here today. And we're going to be spending the next, I'm not sure quite how long, but moving around Vermont and listening to stories, listening to experiences of men and boys and families and communities talking about this issue. And when the film's done, we're going to take it on a roadshow. And we're going to hope to host community conversations around it and do more listening and do more sharing and do more talking with one another. And I just want to bring us full circle to kind of a small part of this whole project, which are these cards on your seats. These story cards for us, bringing Richard was an incredible opportunity for us. But it has also been really important for us to ground these stories in Vermont. And so these cards are the result of kind of months of gathering of comments and stories through lots of partners, counties all over the state. And I have to say that for me, some of them are sort of beautifully mundane, right? They're just kind of about a day in the life. And as a parent, some of them choked me. And listening to the power in those stories, I was really struck about that suicide slide. The thing that struck me was that it only started at 15, and that in this room, there are, I think, 5 stories of boys younger than that who have taken their own lives in Vermont. So I just want to bring us back to these kids, to these young men, to these families who are reflecting. This is why it matters for us to learn how to talk about this. And thank you all so much. The website is reevesvt24.org. There's a link there to receive right now to get your name on the list to receive a link to the video later. My contact information is on it. There's some Q&A. Please feel free to be in touch with us, and thank you all so much again for coming. Thank you, Richard, for those wonderful remarks. And travel safe.